The Sunday school lessons for July 7th, 2024 are Ceaseless Love and Hope Comes in the Morning. Lamentations chapter 3, verses 16 through 24. Welcome, viewers and subscribers, to my channel, Read With Me. I am Audrey. If you are new here, please know that this is an audio reading of the lesson with intermittent commentary. Please help this channel grow by subscribing so that this channel can continue to grow, one viewer and one subscriber at a time. Thank you for all that you do to make this channel what it is and what it has the potential to become. Verses 16 through 18. He has broken my teeth with gravel. He has trampled me in the dust. I have been deprived of peace. I have forgotten what prosperity is. So I say, my splendor is gone, and all that I had hoped from the Lord. Our text begins amid an extended reflection on how God has behaved like one of Judah's vicious enemies, seemingly seeking the people's annihilation. Lamentations chapter 3, verses 3 through 15, not in our printed text. The imagery is of extreme humiliation. Breaking teeth with gravel conveys the experience of being thrown to the ground with such force that the rock-covered ground knocked the victim's teeth out. The poet's physical posture of lying injured on the ground points to the more profound and lasting reality of being brought low spiritually. Ironically, David twice requested that God break the teeth of his wicked enemies. Psalms chapter 3, verse 7, and Psalms 58 and 6. Though this fate may have once been reserved for David's and Judah's enemies, it now enters Judah's own experience as David's descendants and the nation they governed became enemies of God through their persistent rebellion. The humiliating experience is exacerbated by the poet's sense that God has personally forced him down into the dust. The Hebrew indicates the act of forcing someone down and keeping him down, perhaps by pressing one's foot down on his back. A contemporary way of putting it might be, he made me eat dirt. The poet attributes this action directly to God, though no doubt it was the Babylonian invaders who treated the poet and his fellow Judeans harshly. In one sense, this is due to our human tendency to project onto God the cruelty we experience at the hands of human beings. While this is an understandable reaction insofar as God was using the Babylonians as agents of his judgment, Jeremiah chapter 25, verses 8 through 11, it also indicates how traumatic experiences and suffering tend to cloud and confuse our perception of God. We, like the poet, believe that God is in control and might erroneously attribute the evil actions of others to God's own hand. Job chapter 1, verse 12, verse 22, Job chapter 2, verses 6 and chapter 42, verses 1 through 6. In verse 17, the poet reflects on the significant losses he and his community sustained in the wake of their tragedy. Chief among them was any sense of well-being or hope for future prosperity. The poet uses the familiar Hebrew word shalom, translated peace, known to most English speakers as the common greeting in Israel to this very day. The word conveys a broad sense of holistic well-being, of both material security and deep spiritual contentment. Not only had all sense of this security and contentment fled the poet's experience, but he could not even remember what prosperity was. While this could be an example of poetic hyperbole or exaggeration for effect, it also underscores a well documented effect of trauma. The tragedy of Jerusalem's destruction significantly altered how the poet and his community viewed their past. Their present pain threatened to eclipse all memory of past prosperity and permanently cast a dark shadow over the entire story of their emergence as a people and of their relationship with God. In verse 18, it is not clear to whom the poet says this. Did he speak to himself, share with fellow sufferers, or address it to God in prayer? Lamentations chapter 3, verses 23b. Whatever the case, it captured the utter despair that inevitably followed the poet's loss of any sense of well being, contentment, or even the ability to recall pleasant memories from Judah's past. In strikingly absolute terms, the poet dismisses any possibility of a future return to splendor or reason for hope. Whereas the previous verse emphasized the impact the poet's trauma had on his recollection of the past, the present verse emphasizes the effect his trauma had on his vision for the future. In the immediate aftermath of Jerusalem's destruction and all the pain and suffering that came with it, the poet saw no way forward, no path by which he could imagine God advancing his plans for his people. Verses 19 through 21. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The poet in verse 19 captures a nauseating sense that all of life has turned sour and lost all of its taste and delight with the use of two vivid words: bitterness, more literally wormwood as in KJV, and gall. These two extremely bitter tasting plants were often used in medicinal elixirs and teas, as referenced in the Mishnah, an important Hebrew extra biblical text. The plants were notoriously hard to swallow without gagging or vomiting. But in Scripture, these plants are rarely associated with healing and are viewed negatively as having no redeeming value. They are considered toxic. Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 18. The one possible exception is the occasion when gall was offered to Jesus on the cross, presumably as an anesthetic. Matthew chapter 24, verse 30. Matthew chapter 27, verse 34. Though his rejection of it does not speak highly of the substance. In verse 20, the poet reflects on the overall effect this all consuming memory from Lamentations chapter 3, verses 3 through 19 had on the poet. The vivid memories served only to darken the poet's outlook further and depress him. Indeed, they were hardly memories at all, but more like flashbacks, as though the poet relived the experience each time he recalled it. In verse 21, as if recognizing the danger of continuing down the dark paths of bitterness, the poet suddenly turns his thoughts in a very different direction. He draws from the rich tradition of prayer and praise that he undoubtedly knows from his own education beginning in his boyhood. His recollection interrupts the downward spiral of despair with memories that are deeply ingrained through years of study and more profoundly formative than the traumatic memories of recent suffering. The poet can call to mind convictions powerful enough to challenge and hold in check the despondency threatening to dominate his thoughts and determine his outlook. His hope is revived as he begins to view his situation from the perspective of revelation and tradition rather than personal experience. Verses 22 through 24. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. The poet confessed the truth of divine mercy with language reminiscent of the book of Psalms, Israel's hymnal and prayer book. The phrase, the Lord's great love, recalls, among others, Psalms 89, chapter 2, and the 107th division of Psalm, verse 43, where great love is translated as loving deeds and refers to God's long track record of forgiveness and grace that had preserved Israel by withholding the full penalty of the people's sin. This sentiment seemed to inspire the poet to turn his attention to this traditional recitation of the long list of God's merciful actions and faithful interventions on his people's behalf, and to remind his fellow sufferers of this. With this in mind, the poet can see that his survival and the survival of his fellow sufferers is no accident of history, but is instead evidence of God's enduring love. The poet caught himself in a common theological error, the error of pitting God's love against God's wrath as if the two were mutually exclusive. However, divine wrath is a function of divine love. God's anger over Judah's persistent sin was his love taking disciplinary form. His purpose was not to destroy Judah, nor was it to forsake her and give up on his covenant. Rather, the judgment was a kind of radical surgery performed to save the patient. The poet uses the plural form compassions to hint at numerous discrete divine actions motivated by God's amazing tenderness for Judah. The word the poet uses for divine compassion is related to the Hebrew word for womb and has strong connotations of warmth, intimacy, and maternal tenderness. This is a striking and unexpected choice of words on the heels of such vivid descriptions of the carnage and destruction that the poet and his community recently endured, seemingly at God's hands. The significance of the poet's use of the plural compassion in verse 22b again takes center stage here with the assertion that God's compassions are new every morning. In other words, a new expression of divine compassion greeted the poet daily. The poet's previous experiences of the manifold nature of divine mercy assured him that he and his community would somehow experience yet another new death of divine mercy. God's mercy would be equal to the task of healing the deep wounds of Jerusalem's destruction. This is the only one of the poet's statements expressed directly to God as a prayer. In the rest of the text, the poet either addressed himself in an attempt to keep his own faith afloat, or he addressed his community in an attempt to rally them to persevere in faith with him. This is an interesting shift in the poet's rhetoric, considering that elsewhere he seemed to view prayer as an impossibility. Nonetheless, Between those two statements asserting God's unwillingness to hear, the poet praised quite confidently, if briefly. While this may strike readers as odd and perhaps even contradictory, it makes sense considering the circumstances under which the poet wrote these words. In this time of crisis, his faith waxed and waned, ebbed and flowed, as it does for us in our moments of intense trial. The fact that the poet prayed these words rather than addressing them to himself or others raises the possibility that he was looking for reassurance from God that his faithfulness really is great. Perhaps the statement was half assertion and half question. Great is thy faithfulness, right? Either way, the poet was determined to hold on to this hope. In verse 24, the poet drew once again from Israel's prayer book as he desperately sought resources to support his faith through this trial, this time from Psalm 16, verse 5. The term portion refers to the land plots distributed to the various tribes of Israel, according to Moses' instruction, Joshua chapters 18 and 19. This is significant considering that the original land distributed had been disrupted by the exiles of first Israel and then Judah due to their sin. 2 Kings chapter 17 through chapter 2 Kings chapter 17 verses 7 through 23. With the land under the control of the foreign power by which God judged his people, these original land grants were effectively rendered meaningless. Aware that Judah had now forfeited the physical manifestation of God's fidelity to his promise due to sin, the poet made perhaps one of the boldest and most beautiful assertions of faith in all Lamentations. The poet concluded these reflections with a simple statement of his determination to fix all of his hopes in God. Given all that he remembered of God's past faithfulness, both from his personal experiences and from the collective memory of previous generations, carefully preserved in scripture, liturgy, and tradition, the poet can find reasons to wait for him. His was a hope that all the evil in the world could not ultimately sink. After the tears had been shed and the grief, anger, bitterness, and doubt expressed, hope remained. This is just a gentle reminder to the viewers who have not subscribed to my channel. If this video has been of any significance to you, please subscribe to the channel and help this channel grow one viewer and one subscriber at a time. And to those of you who have already begun to share my video with others, thank you so very much for all that you do and all that you have done to make this channel what it is and what it has the potential to become. Thank you once again. Stay safe and may God bless.